Hi there. Thanks for joining me for another study companion video for Benedictine Care Chapter 5. Today you get to move into Stability of Hope. And boy, is this a chapter that I am really looking forward to exploring together with you. In this chapter, you're entering an interesting part of the program and an interesting part of the timing when we know that we're trying to make behavior changes, the vulnerabilities that we start encountering at this time in a program. If you were only going through the core care weight loss and program, at this time it would coincide with the steps 10, which starts the Train Your Brain series, starting with motivation. And so this chapter is going to introduce how this parallels the chapter 10 from the core program on motivation. But importantly, it also is when we get to start um, exploring the ceiling that traditional programs hit. And so, really, this chapter allows us to start hopefully having an aha moment of what some of the limitations are of traditional programming, including the core program, and the opportunities that I saw in working with clients in that ceiling that they were reaching, and hoping that the Benedictine care and our Benedictine tradition and monastic values, and those were kind of those locks to the ceiling that allowed us to go up and further. So this is the chapter that we get to explore that together in. So let's go ahead, and as we start each of these, let's go and just quickly go through together where we've come to date and where we're coming from, and do a quick review. So we started in chapter 1 with our stability of intention, and this laid that just really essential framework and our foundation for remembering that we are already connected to the divine. And so just right away saying, "Hey, that's our reality." And the subsequent chapters have just started building on what does establishing or reestablishing and nurturing that relationship feel like? What is the experience of when we really start doing that? And how does that apply to the ordinariness of lifestyle changes and how we try to sustain those behaviors? So that was our chapter 1 introduction, was just kind of the state of, well, here we are, but what if it really is like this and we have a different way? If we shift our attention over here, there's an entirely different reality that we haven't been paying attention to. So we explored that in chapter 1. And then in chapter 2, we looked and said, well, what starts happening when we really do that? And again, all of Benedictine care and spirituality is really the experience of the practices is the most important part to learn from. It's the very thing within our stability of voice when we start talking about our advocates and our bullies, and we start pulling them, tweezing them out of the lighter voice and even from each other. A really important opportunity is that if we only gave theories and ideas and read a lot about the situation that we're in, and here's some solutions and ways that we could fix it, we are only perpetuating and reinforcing the very paradigm that we're trying to break. And so within Benedictine care, you having the experience is essential in moving forward in each chapter. And that's the reason for that we stagger them only one chapter per month. You need time to have your own personal experience with the material so that when you read the next chapter, you can go deeper in what your personal experience is. Again, the chapters are just kind of cracking open and giving you a place to explore your own reality of what's going on versus telling you how it's supposed to be or telling you how to fix where you are. Not at all. Like, this is really about you starting to have a reality that feels different, and that you have a different experience by doing your practices. And what are you hearing and what are you learning about yourself as you do that? So in chapter 2, we're really introduced to those characters that are going to stay with us as we move through and try to sustain transformative change ongoing. So in chapter 3, we started looking at, if you remember, the challenge that was introduced in chapter 3 is really, now that we had the intention to turn towards from chapter 1, and then in chapter 2, we start realizing and starting to get that space and observe the differences between the different voices that we hear. In chapter 3, we looked at the challenge of doing that and practicing that for a while and realizing just how small our sacred sliver of space is before a choice. And not only is it really small, but that within that space, we can actually hear the conflict between what we thought we really wanted and what we really hear we want. So, what are the wants of the advocates versus what we think we want? Like, we think we want peace and contentment, but in that sacred sliver of space, we actually talked about how getting relief from distress, or how when that what we need at that very moment of choice is actually different than what we think we want. And that's an important realization to have, because once we realize, like, oh, at 6 o'clock at night when I've had a really long, stressful day, I do want to distract myself. I do want the enjoyment of the indulgence in extra dessert. We realize that that's really what we want, and then we're like, okay, well, tomorrow, and then I'll be healthy, and tonight I won't do it again. And that's how we try to reconcile what we think we should want with what we actually want in the moment of choice. And until we reconcile that in the moment of choice, we're being led by the intentions in our heart of heart, we're going to continue to be at conflict with those. And those immediate gratifications and those immediate needs, which are our old default patterns, they are going to be as loud as we found out in chapter 3 that they can be. But in chapter 3, we introduce that the very premise is that we don't have to figure out how to untangle these voices on our own. And that is the beautiful reality of our spiritual practices, is that the divine and our lighter voice and our inner wisdom actually want to help us, and not only help us, but do it. We just need to have the consent and intention that allows for the receptivity to receive their untangling. And this is when we start unclenching our fists, and we can actually pause in those moments and feel willing versus willful. And how we start bonding with the divine and lighter voice to meet them there in the silence where they can do what we call a divine therapy. We introduce the contemplative practice of centering prayer. That this dedicated time to start one session for 20 minutes per day, ideally working up to 2 sessions per day, is really essential to, again, the only intent to nurture that relationship with the divine. We don't sit with the intention saying, okay, if I start doing my centering prayer, then I'm finally going to not feel uncomfortable, or I'm always going to make the right choices. That isn't why we do it. We don't sit with thinking that if I do this, then I'll get a result I want, because guess what that sounds like from chapter 1. So we do our contemplative practices, we do centering prayer with the only intention to sit and nurture that relationship with the divine, and to consent to them starting to work on the embodiment and on untangling those advocates and that false self for us. Okay. Then in chapter 4, we were looking at, when we start doing our centering prayer practice, what's the reality then? Like when we say, okay, I want to prioritize this relationship with the divine in the context of making ordinary lifestyle choices, right? So this is, we have all come in with some level of relationship with the divine already, this was really personalizing it and bring it internally into silence within ourselves and starting to have it influence the very ordinariness of our lives. And so within Centering Prayer, what was that experience like for you? In chapter 4, we talked about how once we start doing that, we can really feel miles away from our heart of hearts. Again, it's one of those things that we're like, well, yeah, it's me, it's right there. Of course, that's what I want. And we can think that we're really connected and really close, but when we really start shifting towards and turning towards deliberately to that relationship, we can realize quickly how much more fragile that relationship was than we might have thought. So, within our Stability of Faith chapter, we started realizing that again, there might be more distrust there than we expected. We much, hear that we should trust the divine, and of course, I trust the divine and I have faith. But when we really kind of tweeze out what those, the reality of those words are, and again, coming into the experience of those words, we can see that our trust is really, really also very fragile. Um, or admittedly, in many, it might be more non-existent on a personal level than people realized. And so in our Stability of Faith, we introduced the importance of having these experiences with our lighter voice and that connection to the divine, so that those experiences, and when we shift to the realization and that awareness of their presence, when we shift our attention each time that we do that, is when we and our advocates have a new experience of trust with our lighter voice in the divine. So, throughout the many years of our life, every time that we have chosen a familiar pattern, that familiar default pattern, over a new pattern or over faith and trust, we reinforce that that old default pattern is better, that we can trust it. And so it has had years and thousands and hundreds of thousands of repetition in building trust that that is a predictable result to get rid of distress. So now when we come in and say we're going to do it a different way, we're actually going to let our inner wisdom lead, there can be a lot of distrust in that. And so in Stability of Faith, the image that we used was that we are actually now standing between our lighter voice and our advocates. We can distinguish them. We understand them individually better, and we're standing in between them now. And the one that we turn towards and allow to lead, we talk about how that will influence everything. And really, to underscore and remind us that just like from chapter 1, when our turn towards is that we do that as often as possible, the reality is that we are going to need much more practice than a few months to get to a place where, and if ever, we have a more continual state of being aligned with that lighter voice. We keep emphasizing in Benedictine care that that is our human condition of we do have that separation of awareness, and that the relationship is reliant on our remembering and our shifting to. And so, just like with Stability of Faith, we are going to maintain this position between those two voices, and it's which one do we turn towards more often that's going to influence that thy will versus my will, the willing versus willful. And that's where we want to nudge to as many moments as possible, that remembrance and that shifting our attention to something else. And that's the process. Same process that reinforced the old patterns. Our brains love to shift their attention on things that work. And we're going to use that same process, but we're going to shift our attention to good, true, and beautiful, to new, to a different pattern, to lighter voice, to divine led. And each time that we do that and we have that feeling that we didn't fall off a cliff and that we actually had a different success than we could have imagined, we're going to gain trust and reinforce that new way to do that transformative change that we have been desiring. So, where do we go now? So, if we were doing stability of faith, we're not quite there yet with the end of the story of what the experience could be like. So, in chapter 5, we get to explore some really, just really pivotal points that make Benedictine care and most likely the efforts at doing change to date. We're going to really see the intersection of traditional practices to do that versus our contemplative practices and how they're doing that. And so let's go ahead and take a look, because as I mentioned, you are entering at this point in the program, you're entering a really vulnerable time in your mind is going to start trying to shift to those old patterns, and it's really going to test which choices and which direction and which intention do you really value. And it won't be fooled. So if in your heart of hearts, if there is nothing that resonates that I do want to align, like that really is, like that is true for me and I can feel that. If there's any piece that doesn't value that within you yet or at this moment, that's going to be a hard shift to continue moving on from. If you're just wrestling with it, if you're wrestling with trust, but it resonates as true, you're going to be fine. That's where the practices, that unfolding of the relationship with the divine is happening. But if you really don't value the shifting to the divine and that being an important element of your transformative change, you are entering and walking out onto this bridge where that's going to be really tested. When you know you value it and you've had up until this point those times of it again feeling like it resonates, where that whole embodiment with your biospiritual focusing, where you can just feel the shifts physically, those senses in your body change because of what the practices you're doing or the way that you're applying this to your lifestyle as medicine choices for stewardship, that's only going to be reinforced, and you're on such strong footing to take those first steps out onto that bridge. So this is a vulnerable time. But here's the exciting thing that chapter 5 is going to talk to is, even if this bridge looks familiar, that there are the people on one side that still have limitations and are only able to adhere to new choices for several weeks or a certain temporary amount of time. And the bridge on the other side connects the people that have transformative change. As familiar as that bridge might feel to you, I hope the presence and the sense that you feel so differently is that this time you are actually hand in hand with the architect of that bridge. So in the previous chapters, we talked about this, standing when you listen to next and you stand in that has you take a space into what feels like a void, or the space feeling empty and barren. This is just looking at that space now as that bridge between just the moment of next to now the future. And that's really what Stability of Hope is now going to start exploring. Is we've to date through chapters 1 through 4 really looked at making and what is that experience in the sacred sliver of space within each individual moment. And now we're going to start looking at those moments as those rungs on the bridge where we are looking at the future. And this is where it gets into why that vulnerability of that sustainability and keeping moving forward and keeping standing in these spaces that feel uncomfortable. But chapter 5 is going to introduce how it's different from the traditional programming. and how traditional psychology hits a ceiling, and that now you have a different key to open that ceiling. And it's just a beautiful open, just like a whole ceiling is just opening up to the sky and everything above it. And that's what we're going to look at in chapter 5, is how assuring and how much more confidence we can have in taking those steps onto that bridge this time for sustaining changes when we see what is beyond the traditional psychology. The other thing we're going to explore in chapter 5 of a challenge that you might be experiencing now is in chapter 4, when we're standing between and we are shifting our attention towards, and still ever since chapter 1, we've been listening for those nudges and listening for guidance for those next steps from our lighter voice. In chapter 5, we're going to look at the reality of that. What are you hearing when you're turning towards? Are you having an experience of I ask but don't receive? And how is that influencing that whole valuation that we just talked about shifting and really valuing that, shifting your attention to the divine is an important and meaningful way for you to sustain change this time. And is that being challenged? Is that trust in that, or that valuing that, being challenged by the experience of I ask but I don't receive? So we're going to take a look at that together. And importantly, another one between those traditionals, when I'm saying those kind of where those meet between traditional programming and just the traditional psychology techniques versus Benedictine care, another really big one that we're going to explore here is in expectations. And with faith and with hope now of extending our faith into the future, we're going to tweeze out and look at the difference between, do you more often have I hope so in your asks? And when you are turning to the divine and when you are searching your environment and in the sacred sliver space, when you're listening for what impulse to do next, is there I hope so's in there? Are there actually your expectations in there versus I have hope, and versus you listening for what the divine wants for you in that moment versus what you want from that moment? And so that's a really important aspect of I ask but don't receive. So we're going to take a look at what is our role within that dynamic and how can we help strengthen it so that we actually can have the true intent for more theological hope, which is trust in the future versus just having immediate desires met. Okay? And then also another thing that we're going to look at in chapter 5 is realizing that we are still standing in uncomfortable. And so we're going to introduce patience in when we look at this future and having faith in the future. We're going to look at those rungs on the ladder, even if we do trust that we are holding the hands of the architect of that bridge. It's going to take practice and more experiences to build that trust, and continuing to stand there is going to be uncomfortable and sometimes fearful, sometimes doubting. So we're going to talk about what really starts to kind of amplify there and hopefully give assurances that, hey, it's just a normal part of the process, and B, how to keep our stability practices allowing us to stay in that space. So the experiences I've really, talked to largely within the challenges that we had. So again, the experience we want to introduce and see how this experience feels for you as you practice chapter 5 is, again, that realization and that knowing that you're hand in hand with the architect of the bridge. And we're going to introduce Gerald May's contemplative psychology. And this is just a beautiful framework for how it is not about throwing out traditional psychology. It is just way too influential, and it's just way too important of the collective lighter voices that have contributed to this field So Gerald May was a psychiatrist, and his proposition is that we don't throw that out. We just need to evolve psychology to be a contemplative psychology, where psychology becomes in service to spirituality. So we're going to introduce that in this role. Again, we're going to explore our role in I ask but don't receive. We're going to understand patience beyond just our more traditional usage of that word, is that it means I have tolerance. Like, you're not being very patient. It kind of means like I'm fidgeting, or I just don't have tolerance. I'm a little restless. And there's a much more, when we look at the root word of patience, it's actually a much deeper word than tolerance. And we're going to introduce that in chapter 5 of understanding its true meaning and definition, and how, when we can hold on to that, how important that is for that perseverance as we practice our stability. And also, we're going to talk about enlarging our center. So we talked about in chapter 3 that centering prayer was named from Thomas, it's credited to Thomas Merton for his definition of, centering one's whole self on God and the divine. And so in chapters 1 through 4, we really shifted of, looking at that focus of being centered on the true self versus the false self. And we talked about being centered on the divine and on God with our centering prayer and contemplative practices. In chapter 5, we're going to use that same premise, and we're going to apply it to how beneficial it can be if we actually enlarge what we're centered on and what is going to be maintained as a us being us. So we're going to talk about that and how that contributes to embracing the beautifully complex. And finally, a big experience that is going to be introduced to this, and many of you have heard me talk about already, the mini trampoline. It's officially introduced in this chapter through the process skipping and understanding what that means. And so within process skipping, the short teaser for it is that anytime we use something, an activity, anything that we use, a substance that we use to distract or escape from going into the embodiment of the untold stories that are housed within our body. Anytime we avoid the distress and the bigger untold stories, any activity that we do to avoid that is called process skipping. So instead of processing and using our biospiritual focusing to actually go and sit in a caring presence with those untold stories that are still housed in the nervous system, when we don't process those stories that way, it's called process skipping, when we try to distract or escape ourselves from that. And so we're going to go into more detail together, and it just is a really, I hope you find it to be a really valuable way to go, oh, that's what I'm doing. And we just try to do it once we become aware of it, and we do it less often. There's going to be moments again where sometimes just doing the intensity might be too much. And so doing something to just help regulate our nervous system is going to be important. And we're going to talk about that in chapter 6, is that when we do have this intensity and now we're not bouncing away, well, then what do? So be assured that that's going to be addressed, and we're going to do some activities together with that in chapter 6. For now, become aware of your own process skipping patterns. And it's going to be really important, as you'll see a quote in there, of how understanding your own process skipping is just very important for the maturity of development in how we view our whole self. So I hope you find that as valuable and impactful as it has been for me. And then finally, chapter 5 just has a fun listen, then seek activity. There's nothing new for you to do. We're continuing our centering prayer and contemplative practice, and we're doing our biospiritual focusing. This is just going to have us look and shift in our environments now. When you read, what our role could be in this I ask but don't receive, in this practice, we're going to try to remember that, of saying, when I'm listening in that sacred sliver of space, am I approaching my days and am I approaching my moments? Am I trying to find the elements in my environment that are my wish list? Or am I actually shifting and listening to find the things that are on the divine's want list? And so we're going to talk about that together in just a really light practice with some images that I hope you find fun to help you do that during the day. Again, it's focusing on what is there in the environment versus what is missing. Okay, so I hope you enjoy that too. And finally, as all chapters do in Benedictine Care, it comes down to turn towards, then act. That's it. Chapter 5, just like the other chapters, we just get to explore and have fun running around and what that experience of being human and us being us feels like when we start doing that regularly. So please see that simplicity in all of this again, that is the basic thing that was introduced right away in chapter 1 is turn towards, then act. All the others is just us companioning each other in what that experience is really like and helping each other be supportive as we wait with patience in those sacred slivers of space for that divine led guidance. So thank you so much for watching this video. I hope you found it valuable, and I will be so excited to hear how your responses and reactions go to reading the chapters in our group meetings or on the online forums. So again, thank you. Enjoy the chapter, and we'll talk again very soon. Bye-bye.